Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Liquid Antiquarian with myself, Mr. Broom, and my dear friend, Lord Arthur Motley. Speaking from, I don't know, it looks like here in San Gimignano behind you. But,
I think that's a Tuscan scene maybe, but I'm actually in sweaty London.
There we go. Yeah, sweaty London. Anyway, welcome, folks. Welcome to our patrons. Thank you, as ever. Welcome to the people who have just joined us, who might not be patrons, but by the end of this will want to become patrons, because without your support, Arthur wouldn't be able to do what he has done for this particular episode, which is forage in foreign parts. That sounds really rude. It's not meant to. Forage in foreign parts for strange, old, completely forgotten manuscripts. This is a biggie, folks. I know we kind of say that every time, but we keep uncovering lots of fascinating stuff, and this one really came out of left field. So, Arthur, this is entirely your episode. I shall interject as and when, but I'm going to sit back and revel in the extraordinary discoveries that you have made. Over to you, my friend.
Well, yeah, I did find the thing, and we are driven by things that we find. You know, there's always material culture or primary evidence, and but you were greatly supportive in what was a really difficult task. We have been away a little while, and one of the reasons was this was quite tricky to pull together, partly because it relates to what feels like an entirely unreferenced document, at least in the whiskey literature, and it comes from Finland. And so earlier this year, I was asked to speak at the Nordic Whisky Forum in Helsinki. I'm off there in the right, lurking in the background next to the still, and talking to a conference of amazing Nordic distillers, of which there are many very exciting distilleries with amazing people producing really cool spirit, and that was great. And on my day off, I went wandering around, and I went to this amazing bookshop in Helsinki, Hagelstam. There's going to be a lot of words that we're pronouncing today, which we're probably pronouncing wrong. Our apologies to the Finns. Anyway, I went into this bookshop, and it was quite busy, and then it quietened down, and the woman looked really nice. So I just said, look, have you got anything to do with alcohol? And she beetled around the back, and she came out with this strange little pamphlet. I'm going to say 60 odd pages in Finnish in this wonderful Gothic script. Only one illustration, but she said, yes, this is about distilling, something to do with farmhouse distilleries. And luckily the shop quietened down, so I probably spent half an hour to an hour and asked her to just gradually translate on the hoof various sections of it, so I could get a kind of a feel for it. And what she was saying was really intriguing, sounded interesting. It wasn't cheap, but from what she said, it gave me the confidence to have a bit of a punt. And Patreon guys, you support us, and the money that comes our way allows us to take a little bit of a risk on a rare old document like this. So thank you. I might, 2 years ago, I might not have felt like I could afford to buy this on a whim. I am so glad I did, because when I got it home and I used various bits of software and spent quite a long time translating it and getting a confidence on the translation, I realized it was something really significant and totally extraordinary. And what delighted me was it kind of astonished me. It astonished me because it was a really quite comprehensive guide to distilling at farmhouses and kind of practical advice, saying that distilling was happening, but they wanted to improve it, and all sorts of little techniques. And on the whole, it seemed really familiar as well. And this document is from 1815. And we have some references to what's going on. We've learned actually together on Liquid Antiquarian what's going on around that turn of the 19th century period. And we did an episode using this amazing book by John MacDonald in Elgin in Scotland, talking about various techniques. And we actually recreated something called Bub from that with Hollywood Distillery. But you look around, you read around, and once you found this weird thing, you immediately think, is it just us? Do we just not know about it? My first thing is like an excited phone call to Dave, and you're used to these by now, and you say, I'm going, am I crazy, or did you know anything about this? Am I crazy or ignorant? I don't know. And you said, nope, I know nothing about this as well. So we started to look around the record and how people in the modern industry of Finland talk about their whiskey history, and there's some great ones. I mean, I've highlighted two. There's Kira Distillery. That's the chaps in the sauna. They're closely linked to sauna culture, which is very strong. And Tirin Pili, which makes great whiskey over in Finland. I could have chosen some others, but like this is from Kiro's website, for example, and they're specialists in distilling rye. And they say, with rye thriving in abundance in the brutal Finnish climate and having been a culinary staple for centuries, why had anyone thought of turning it into whiskey? So there seemed to be a lack of knowledge in Finland, and that excited me even more, that lots of people were making whiskey or a kind of proto-whiskey, but something equivalent to what was happening in Scotland. So got really excited. And, the Wikipedia page for Finnish whiskey history makes no mention before the 80s when the state, because we're going to talk about state control over in Finland later on, they were actually experimenting with making whiskey and then blending what is effectively a whiskey with Scottish spirit. And that actually was quite a popular brand in Finland then, but it seems to be a lack of knowledge. So that got us super excited. We knew we were onto something, and yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to run through this. So the basic episode structure is, book, translation, and kind of purpose. That's what I've already said to you. We're going to look in a bit of detail in the actual contents of the book with the kind of technical side of it. And it's going to be a kind of, is it like Scotland? Is this familiar or is it unfamiliar process that we run through? We're going to talk about the people who wrote it, the people who commissioned it, and the politics that go around that. Why has this knowledge disappeared? And that's about regulation, temperance, and state control, we think. And then we need to have a bit of a chat, don't we, Dave?
We do. We do, indeed.
Because, I mean, in my previous life, before I got into whiskey, I studied archaeology, and I felt rather like an archaeologist who discovered some weird thigh bone in the plains of Africa that kind of suddenly was in the wrong place. And it was the wrong age, and then suddenly the framework had to shift a bit. Now that makes it sound rather grand. It's only our little world of spirits, but that's how I felt.
Yeah. Well, I think you're justified in thinking that.
Yeah.
It's expanded our knowledge. So yeah.
Good. Ready to roll credits?
Sorry?
Roll credits?
Roll credits.
Okay, great. So let's fire in then. So I'm going to show a lot of slides, and there's a few caveats here. So obviously I'm working in a language that I speak no Finnish at all. And so I've had to have some tools to help me when I run through these slides. I hope either watching live or either on catch up, we have some Finns watching. That would make us delighted.
Yes.
But I am reliant on translations. The main body of the translation was coherent what came out, and I ran through various. It's complex, but I spent a lot of effort. I didn't just dump it in ChatGPT, put it that way.
Yeah.
And so for these slides and for the benefit of the Finns, I've tried to put the Finnish alongside the English, and checking it seems to have worked. If it hasn't quite lined up, please give us some latitude. But anyway, so we're going to have the English alongside the Finnish. The English is at the top. So let's run through. We're kind of basically going to do the grains used, the equipment used, and then fermentation, distillation, and a few other bits and bobs.
Yeah.
So just a general comment to the beginning, which is basically saying you can distill from pretty much anything if you've got a bit of sugar. It mentions potatoes. Potatoes will come into it. But then this last sentence, in these northern provinces, however, spirit is chiefly distilled from the various kinds of grain, especially wheat, rye, barley, and oats. So that's not a surprise. The chap who wrote this, Julin, Julin, there you are, Johannes Julin. He says from the outset, and he's a strong believer, as indeed MacDonald, that Scottish reference I said, was that mixed mash bill is best. That is what he is recommending. But that doesn't mean, and it's quite clear, as you will see in a moment, that was what everyone was doing, but that's what he's saying. And there's a lot of emphasis on output and maximizing the raw materials that you have, and it's principally for that reason. He does talk about taste a little bit, but when he's talking about certain grains. So let's start with barley and malt to begin with. So if we move down, so experienced householders believe they have found that grain made entirely into malt yields no more distilled spirit than unmalted grain to which 1/6 or 1/8 part malt has been added. So it's kind of repeating what he's saying there. But crucially, he is saying that people have been making effectively malt spirit. Interesting.
Yep.
He is saying and recognizing that barley is indispensable in distilling, which is well understood, principally for assisting fermentation. But also, and that's for the reason of the enzymes, isn't it, Dave?
It is. Yeah. Endogenous enzymes.
Exactly. But also, it helps prevent scorching on the bottom. And I think this maybe relates to rye, which we'll come on to later on, which is famously sticky. He's not 100% keen on barley either, because he says it's quite light and tends to spurt or foam out of the still. But you can do it. And you just have to be a bit careful with the fire. So he's describing it as being a bit lively. He's saying it has a cleaner taste. And not quite as sharp as rye. So that's a merit for flavour, I suppose he's saying. And then this last line, the spent mash from barley spirit is also more palatable to animals than that from rye. This will repeat as we go through. The use of the draff, the byproduct, is extremely important throughout this text. Does
open up an area that we've touched on, but I think we'll probably explore a little bit more about the motivation behind making, behind distilling. You know, was it for whiskey or was it for draff? And I think, as we move towards our next big project, it's something that's going to come up. Yeah.
Yes. But then he's saying you could actually make spirit without any malt at all, but in that case you need to use lots of oats, and I wonder if they malted those oats, but he doesn't specifically say it. And then again, talking about flavour, spirit made from oats has a clean and pleasant taste, but its spent mash is weaker than that from the stronger kinds of grain. MacDonald in Scotland, incidentally, doesn't really talk about flavour much, but he does keep mentioning the different flavours. And oats are also useful, especially as part of a mixture. It's common to mix them with rye, by which the rye spirit is made more palatable. In mixing and distilling the mash, oats give almost the same benefit as malt, but they raise the mash in the mash tun and keep it suspended during distillation so that it does not burn on the bottom. And I think much later than MacDonald, into the late 19th century, early 20th century, that there are examples of Scottish distillers and obviously Irish distillers using oats for that filtration element. Am I right, Dave?
Yes, that and rye, actually. A lot of rye was used for filtering, certainly in grain distilling in Scotland. you see rye being used in the mash bill, and you go, "Oh, I wonder what the grain whiskey tastes like." But it was predominantly for husks. So
Yeah, cool. Well, you mentioned rye. Good timing, Dave. Good timing. So rye is distilled in spirit here with the greatest profit, but that could mean that rye grows more plentifully, so therefore is a little bit cheaper, possibly. I would say so. But when properly treated, that's important, because there are a few Scottish distillers who've tried making rye, and that they all have bags under their eyes, don't they, Dave? They look a bit stressed.
I was any distiller anywhere in the world who has attempted to make rye whiskey has gone essentially had a nervous breakdown because it's so problematic. It sticks, it scorches, it foams, it just is a bastard to work with. But the same thing, but the same token, every distiller who has gone through that nervous breakdown still returns to rye because the spirit is so fantastic.
Yeah, so it's so flavorful, isn't it? And it suits the mood of the whiskey drinker, intense. But yeah, the mash tends to sink in the still and burn onto the bottom, therefore rarely distilled alone. And then they actually say that wheat is the best of all and the most productive of all. But jumping onto the last line here, there's very little of it, and so it's presumably expensive. And yes, wheat spirit would consequently be so expensive here that it could not be sold at a profit. So wheat's the best, but we can't do it. But that might be the crop is greener on the other side, maybe.
Also, sorry to interject there. I think that very last sentence is quite interesting because you're thinking about farm distilling, and you're thinking, well, they're using it for themselves. It's not a commercial enterprise. And actually, that last sentence infers that that there is perhaps a commercial element at work here. That should you wish to start making spirit in better quality, there's a business to be made. So yeah, it's an interesting phrase at the end there, I think.
Yeah, and then finally, potatoes. So there seems to be a push, a movement for potatoes generally, and describes how to make them basically. And that picture that I showed earlier on, and with the one illustration, that was like a potato mincer. In fact, I'll get it up again. There you go. That's for kind of crushing the potatoes for this purpose, and also bread that we'll come on to later on. So there's movement towards potatoes generally as being a good crop to use, and it seems to be something that they are keen on. But otherwise, you treat it in the same way as an ordinary mash made from grain, and also spirit may be distilled from frozen potatoes. With more profit than the fresh ones, but you shouldn't let them thaw and rot. And then this last line, the spent mash from potatoes is as suitable for livestock feed as any other spent mash. So yeah, the barley is great for the livestock, the potatoes is good, the rye is not so good. That's one of the reasons maybe why they're suggesting other things. But I mentioned that he likes mixed mash bill, and he thinks that's the most profitable way to do things, and he actually gives a preferred mash bill.
Amazing.
Which is handy. And for several years, so that there is experience there, and we'll come on a bit to where he's got his experience for and his background. But I have looked at these weights and measures and things of what a leviska is, but as it's proportional, we can compare it. But basically, lots of barley, little bit of rye, little bit of malt. And as we have some examples, I thought I'd put them into a pie chart for us, Dave, to just have a little look, because, well, we'll maybe come on to this a bit, but it's like, where's this coming from? Have they learned from Ireland? Have they? Because this is, as we've run through this so far, Dave, most of this is pretty familiar so far, I would say.
It seems, this could be a distilling manual from Ireland or from Scotland or from the States, actually. I'm thinking a lot in terms of American distilling at the same time.
Yeah, but let's not draw arrows on a map just yet. No, but it's inevitable that you want to compare it. So I did compare it. So I've got Julian's one in the middle, and I've got an example from the Penny Encyclopedia, which was actually referenced in Fionn O'Connor's book, thesis, Still With Us. Yeah, so it's not the same. We're not we're not saying that. What are we saying? We're not saying that Julian's lifted this from somewhere else. He's not saying that this is the best way to do it because he's read elsewhere. It's different to all these other two. And then the one on the right is also from Still With Us, from Mr. O'Connor, and what he describes as a common 1800s Irish mash bill. So oats are actually in Scotland. Oats is not in Fionn O'Connor's one. We know that Julian or the distillers in Finland were using oats, but he's not recommending it. And in the Irish mash bill, they are using wheat because they can get it, and presumably at a reasonable price. So it's different.
Very, very quickly, their oats were far more common place in Ireland. Wheat was relatively rarely used because of exactly what you said, because of availability. If there was a glut of wheat was used. But I think the point here is that mixed mash bills are commonplace, and they're commonplace through the 18th century. They're not a sudden phenomenon in the 19th century. They're, that is the way in which whiskey was made, and we have to get that information understood. This notion of whiskey always being just barley simply isn't true.
Yeah, and in Scotland also. I mean, with that graph as well, there's some bits of salt we need to sprinkle on that one, because there's a scale of distillery thing here as well. That Penny Encyclopedia one is probably talking about a larger lowland distillery, I would say, in 1833. But we know that pre-1823, even the smaller distilleries in Scotland were also using unmalted barley and oats and all sorts of bits and bobs. And Ireland, as the amazing work from Fionn has shown, that there are, by that point, some very big distilleries, but there are also lots of small distilleries, and there's a lot of variation. There is a lot of variation. So there's a pinch of salt. But
the one thing that surprises me with that is the very small amount of malt that they were using in Finland for that enzymic activity. And if there's any distillers watching, please tell us what they think might have been the result of that. Would you get full conversion or not? Anyway.
Okay, so that's the mash bills, which was the first thing. Was like, wow, this is really interesting, the mash bills, to have this. I wouldn't even know they were up to this, because I couldn't really find any discussion of that in Finland. So let's move on a little bit more to like the purpose of distilling, and just this simple point. Actually, many people in our country practice distilling more for the purpose of increasing the food available to their livestock through the spent mash than for obtaining a large yield of spirit. I love that quote, Dave, because we know that Draff was important in Ireland and Scotland, and it was one of the reasons that distillers existed. But they are throughout the descriptions, and actually they're saying the Draff is the main purpose, to be able to keep the livestock alive through a cold winter, which I know they have in Finland, and they're actually saying that is the reason for it. So, as I say, we'll come on to who the manual was designed for and who wrote it, but he's talking to farmhouse distilleries a lot. This is to be disseminated out into the countryside, but he's already noting how important Draff is.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Important.
Water. So there is pretty good understanding of the right type of water to use. They differ in quality and strength, which is a slightly unusual kind of word to use, I suppose, from a modern perspective. But it's about assisting the distilling process to a greater or lesser degree. And he recommends water which readily dissolves soap and soft soap, which is water taken from rapids, melted snow water, and rainwater have been the most suitable for preparing the distilling mash. So that's presumably not well water and bog water. That's the only things left, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what type of water readily dissolves soap and soft soap, Dave?
That'd be soft. Yeah, what we would term soft water. Yeah.
Yeah, which is renowned, as familiar, right? In terms of how they talk about Scotland. Okay, so let's move on to fermentation. There's just some nice descriptions of how they're talking about fermentation. But here, if I jump to the last slide. Well, it says a little bit earlier, loses the sharp smell just mentioned and changes to vinegar, and some of the spirit is kind of lost. By that he means at a later stage, I would imagine. But so he's talking about a second fermentation, a sour fermentation, and he's talking that as spoiled. And I suppose in scientific terms we would call that, Dave.
Well, that's kind of malolactic, but it's a ferment that's been allowed to go on too long, and it's one of the problems that you would get. Maybe if you're using open top fermenters and you've got lots of wild yeast coming in, maybe not being able to cool your ferment, so it's spoilage. I mean, what they're talking about there is spoilage. At the same time, if you think of today's ways of making whiskey with extended long fermentations, you kind of want that bit of acidity in there, but it's always that kind of fine balance. It can easily tip over into sourness.
Yeah, they're really worried about it, actually.
And they're really, For those of you interested, refer back to the Dunder episode. There was quite a lot. We had a long discussion about how to control acidity and ferment at that point.
Yeah, and some people chased it even in those early days, wasn't there? The 1799 one, that guy up in Oban. So carrying on with fermentation. So he's saying about 36 hours it is at its height. Another place I think he maybe says 48 hours is okay. And he also says, don't try and do it too quickly. It needs to fully ferment. And then it's this it gives off a sharp apple-like sour smell, which catches in the nostrils. I think if you've been around a Scottish distillery and they open up the washback and tell you to take a sniff of that, you certainly get that sharp smell burning your nostrils, that CO2 coming off. But anyway, lovely description. And that's what they're doing. So I maybe jumped a little bit. We want to talk about fermentation because we should also talk about yeast as well. That's obviously a crucial part of it. It's the yeast that is eating the sugar to create the alcohol and those lovely appley smells and that CO2 and alcohol being produced. Because meet our old friend Bub.
Yay!
There is a description of what is effectively making bub. And again, we can refer to our own work, can't we, Dave? It's all starting to add up. Because we did an episode with Holyrood Distillery, again, taking information from McDonald, where there was a recipe for making bub. And that was something that always puzzled me. And hops were an important ingredient. And here we have it. So you get strong wort, good malt, and make a strong wort, which effectively means lots of sugar, I would say. Mix in some hops, and boil the wort down. Well, it's exactly the same process. Exactly the same process as we did in that bit of experimental archaeological distillation, if you want to call it that. Then this just lovely little touch here in terms of how they describe it. When the water's cooled until it is only as warm as fresh flatbread. Then they whisk more barley flour into it, which wasn't in the McDonald recipe, but you've got, and then some balm as well, and maybe a yeast starter. Mix it, cover it, and leave it to ferment for a few days. That's actually slightly different. The flour addition and then leaving it to ferment for several days. In McDonald, it was kind of used within 5 hours or overnight, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been minor, but they are making bub.
Yes.
And that's quite a specific thing. Like that is quite specific. And the recipe is really similar.
Yes, yeah, it's extraordinarily similar. And adding hops, bacterial, not essentially flavor, although as we found out, it does give flavor, but for their antibacterial qualities. Really exciting. And then using the barm, which is essentially either recycling of previous ferment, or maybe from beer, or maybe from bread, maybe from a sourdough starter. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, and then just briefly about the bub use. You add more barley flour.
Yeah, they just feed it.
Yeah, feed it. Yeah, exactly. There's plenty of people who made sourdough over lockdown. Maybe they're still making sourdough after that habit formed. That was interesting. Potash, which I think will come up later on, mixing into it. Again, removing sourness. They're concerned about sourness. Sourness is seen as a fault as it going wrong, because they have lots of concerns about cleanliness generally, which is good. There's lots of recommendations of the time elsewhere in Europe to keeping a distillery clean. The Dutch were famous for having scrupulously clean distilleries much earlier. But here is about inverting tons over a pot filled with glowing coals upon the floor, and then sulfuring it. Because if you don't do this, if this has been neglected and the plandy tastes musty or sour before the yeast starter is added, another solution is to stir more potash into it to remove that defect. They use the word defect. Mash tuns must be clean and dry, can't smell sour or musty. And it recognizes that they tend to acquire a sour smell after a few uses. And so you've got to wash it, you've got to scrub it, you've got to clean it, and then you've got to fill it with ash lye. Ash lye, Dave, what's that?
It's essentially a caustic. It's a highly alkaline substance. So again, for cleanliness, and also for you see people being poisoned with lye in Victorian Gothic novels. So yeah, it is fairly unpleasant stuff. As is caustic soda, which is essentially is what people use to clean the stills today. So yeah, it's essentially making sure it's had a really good scrub, but for God's sake, get rid of it before you add anything in to ferment.
Yeah. They also use thermometers, which is seen but not emphasized that much in McDonald's and a few other places. The thermometers were around, but it's mostly hydrometers, isn't it, that they're using as a scientific element.
That's really exciting. You see that in some American, in Scotland certainly sees in some American distilleries as well, being contemporaneous with this. But yeah, I mean, that's here is science. Here is control. Here is an understanding of what is going on. I find that really, really interesting.
Yeah. So we can move on to equipment. And well, the first bit is extremely familiar. What are the pieces of apparatus you need? A still. Sorry, I should clarify. The pot of a still, the breast of a still, and the head of a still. We're going to see a couple of types of still that they have here. Condensing pipes. Again, we're going to see a couple of different types of condensing pipes. A cooling vessel, and the mash tun, which is slightly in the wrong order how he's expressed it. But anyway, that's familiar. There's nothing particularly unusual there. But in terms of the nature of the still, here Julian is saying that you're as well using a larger still because it takes as much labor and it takes as much fuel, the same number of implements as a large and roomy one, and you're going to get more in spirit and in spent mash again, which is called wrapper. So yeah, it's always more profitable to a large one and a small one. How large a still is permitted to each farm, however, is precisely determined by the orders of the high authority. So we're going to come on the high authority, Dave.
I love it. Yeah, it's very mythic, actually. It's the spirits are coming down. I love it.
So we'll come on to a little bit about what I know so far about legislation, but that is an indication that there is some control. It's not a free for all that the farmers can do. But I didn't actually put a slide in for this. It was a bit of a mistake of me. But he does talk about still shapes as well, and he actually says that some people are using stills that are kind of wide at the bottom. They come in and then they go out again, which again familiar to Scotland. But he's saying no. You use effectively straight stills. He likes straight stills.
Right.
At some point. I'm not sure if I mentioned that to you. But otherwise, broadly familiar.
Yep.
And also, if you go back to the late 18th century, early 19th century, I imagine the still shapes are a little bit more varied than we give credit for.
Yeah.
We all assume it's the pot still shapes that we remember. And of course, we have those weird flat-bottomed lowland stills, very broad stills as well. So there's familiarity there. This one was a little bit weird. Now here they're describing a gutter. So a rebate or a gutter sloping towards the pipe. When the spirit vapors have condensed upon the roof of the head, they immediately collect in this gutter immediately and run from it into the pipe instead of falling back into the still. Less familiar, Dave?
Yes, it points to a dislike of reflux. Pretty rapid distillation. And if you've also got a spurting still, and if I always wanted to say that, if your still is spurting, you're going to get some degree of carryover, and now you're sort of encouraging everything to come across really quite quickly. So that intrigues me.
Yeah, and if you don't know, I can't assume everyone knows, but reflux is this idea that there's vapor kind of swirling around. It doesn't quite make over to condense, so it effectively gets more distillation, like and more copper contact, and that is good for creating a pure, light, elegant spirit, or even at this basic level, something not a bit filthy. It sounds like could turn out a bit filthy if they would distill gutter, but where are we? Still gutter. Okay, so the bottoms of the stills. So formerly made either flat or convex downwards. It's been customary to make them convex upwards, so into almost inside the still again. He's not sure which is better, but I'm pretty certain. I think Alan, when I ran some of this by me, he said they'd been kind of trying that in the lowlands a bit. So that's about efficiency, like how do you get as much spirit out as possible. Then I mentioned different types of still, and there'll be a slide later on that shows this, but they talk about lifting stills and kind of fixed stills. So stills that kind of get moved around and the lids can get lifted off. And that might be space, or it doesn't seem to be because of hiding stills. There seems to be a bit more of an accepted kind of culture of distilling here. It's more about stirring the stills as well. So there were two solutions on the fixed stills. They could have an opening, so you could get your stick in and give it a stir, or your copper blade or your twig broom on a pole and give it a stir. Or the lifting stills, you just take the head of the still off, give it a good old stir, or not put the head on until the right point when you're giving it a stir. So I suppose the reason for that stirring, Dave, is to avoid scorching.
But because you've got this potential problem with scorching, so you want to get it's a very, very crude rummager right at the very beginning of the process. And I do wonder another reason, they're distilling quite quickly, so they're kind of wanting to get stuff off as quickly as possible. So they're stirring it then, getting it off. The longer they run, the more likelihood there is of more scorching taking place, for it's all over live flames. So was that a matter of expediency? Yeah.
But that would bring some dangers, I would think.
Yes. Yes.
When distilling with a removable breast, care must be taken to fasten it with screws or rods. One end of each rod bearing against the ceiling, so kind of fixed and pushing down from the ceiling. I've never heard of that. And the other against the breast. Yeah. Otherwise, the breast may come loose, the mash may foam out, and people standing by may be injured. I dare say they would.
They'll be injured. Yeah, they'll be scalded. Yeah, it does seem a bit kind of arse about face, I must admit. Yeah. If you we've noticed this, we'll kind of try and fix the still instead of kind of taking a step back and going, well, why is this happening? Maybe because we're taking we're taking the lid off and allowing incredibly hot liquid to scald people. So
yeah, Alan reminded me of a slide that we put a long time ago. I don't even know what episode it was, of a woman getting horribly burnt in Scotland, actually. And it sounded like something similar might have been going on there. But anyway, so we can't rule it. Yeah, we can't rule it out that happened in Scotland as well. There's an understanding as well of how, and a concern, I suppose, of how different grains behave in the still as well. So they talk about lighter grains, and I think that's ones that distill as well a bit more easily. I think there's a reference to the lighter ones. The spirit seems to come off earlier rather than just lightness in terms of density. Bit of interpretation from me there. But the one's less liable to scorch on the bottom. So yeah, this is being concerned about scorching. Mixing, if you're just using rye, mix in some spring sown grain. And yeah, mash made from lighter grains tends to readily spurt from the still. The reason for this is not yet known. Again, more on reasons for scorching. So the mash or plandy has been made too thick. Lumps of balls of flour have remained in it and stick and adhere to the bottom, or partly whole grains sink there. I think they still refer to that as balling, do they, Dave, in Scotland?
Yeah, especially with rye. If your mashing water is too hot, rye will form these kind of balls, and it's quite hard to break them up. So yeah.
Yeah. Number 3. The plandy, the mash has been made from rye, or we covered that, I think. Yeah. And he also says the still comes too slowly to the boil because of green fuel or other causes. The sooner the still begins to boil, the better. That is unfamiliar. Like going right back to, again, more of our work, Henricus van Wijngaarden, even Dr. Boerhaave, right back into the late 17th century and early 18th century. They talk about, bring the fire up gently, be careful. They're like, crank it.
Get it over. Get it done as quickly as possible. We only want the draft.
Yeah. And the other problem, which is kind of alluded to already, is so scorching and then there's foaming. So without this space, I've cut off an earlier bit there. They're saying don't fill the still too much, although it seemed to be a bit higher than 2/3, which Wijngaarden and Boerhaave advised. But yeah, you need to leave it a bit of space, otherwise it'll foam, especially if the mash began a new fermentation in the still. This may happen if the mash was too cold when the starter was added, or if the starter was too weak and the mash consequently did not fully ferment beforehand. And then there's a kind of remedy to that, get the fire going again so it boils as quickly as possible, and that will stop your scorching. I have not heard about spirit re-fermenting in the still. That's a new one on me, Dave.
New one on me. Yeah, you don't want that, really, do you? For a whole number of reasons.
Yeah, no, that's one of the first lessons at Heriot-Watt University. I think your fermentation should be done by the time you get to your distilling part.
I mean, it kind of points to essentially the need for this book. I think there are probably some less good practices that are being applied. So this is why this is why he is writing this, that, don't do this. Also, I would say his mention of larger stills are better. That would make sense, because if you're filling a small still relatively full with wash, you are, the likelihood of getting carryover if you're lighting a very hot fire underneath it is great. And if you have a larger still, you've got a bit more headspace, and therefore the chances of carryover are reduced. So it fits together. He's talking about good quality reasons for taking his advice.
Yeah. Then this bit's kind of weird. So spurting, which can be very harmful to distilling, beware the spurt, according to a person named Brisbane, can be prevented in the following manner. And I started to think, oh, like it's a purifier. It's not quite that. Fit a broad round pipe into a large opening made in the breast. The foaming plandy can rise into this pipe and be drawn from it into a separate vessel, either through a tap or through another smaller pipe fitted to it, whose mouth can be stopped with a clay plug or another suitable stopper. The plandy, which spurts out in this manner, does not obstruct the ordinary passage through the condensing pipes. It may later be poured from the separate vessel into the next charge of the still.
Wow.
So they've got like this foaming still with like stuff coming over, and the solution is, get it out again and just shove it in the next one.
Yeah. Get it over there.
Yeah, I'm not an expert distiller. It's not how I would do it.
It's not how I would do it. Although I think if anybody was going to do it these days, I think Kai's would. So
yes. Hi Johnny, thank you for your support. Fuel. So there's a lot about construction of a distillery, actually, and some of that is quite interesting. If maybe we'll share a bit more information to the Patreon crew. But he talks a lot about how you actually build a distillery in cold conditions. And we ran out of room. There's a limit on StreamYard in terms of number of stills we could slides we could use. So I haven't included it, but they actually talks about distilleries built of wood, which obviously is a common way to build buildings up in the Nordics. But he says you have problems with steam, and there's a lot of discussion of tarring the roofs and making sure it's kind of airtight, but stone floor is essential, etc., etc. So, but anyway, so basically says, use a skillful mason, he'll get it. But once the still has begun to boil, coarse chips of half-dry wood are particularly suitable as fuel. They burn evenly and give heat without a strong flame. That was quite good timing that you mentioned Kynes, who are using wood-fired stills. Worms. So let's talk about condensers. And as the spirit comes out, you have to condense it. So he's not entirely. He describes a worm. There's two or more straight types, or with larger stills of a single pipe bent like a screw, which is also called a worm. Experience has shown that neither arrangement is particularly good, the two straight pipes, and both have commonly had the fault of being narrower at the root and wider at the outer end that they should be. It kind of feels the wrong way round for us, but but anyway, I'm not sure about that part. But in addition, it's hard to keep them tight, i.e. to avoid leakage, and clean. It's more liable to leak, So straight pipes are therefore better, since they can be repaired and cleaned more easily and not as expensive as a bent pipe, which would certainly be true. More copper, and I imagine a coppersmith is trickier to make a curly-whirly worm than a straight pipe.
Yeah, that kind of reverse, because it seems to suggest it's wider leaving. No, it's the opposite. It's narrower leaving the still and wider at the end, which is kind of.
Yeah, I may follow up on that. It was the second reference. Anyway. But that's kind of familiar. But it's maybe cost over quality, I would say, because straight pipes don't sound as good as a worm to me. But then he describes a condenser.
Amazing.
Which in 1815 is now, condensers are familiar absolutely, but 1815 feels awful early. So the newer cooling apparatus, excuse me, the so-called vapor condenser, is a broad double pipe made of thin copper. A smaller pipe passes through the middle of a larger round pipe, leaving a space about 2 tuma wide all around between them. It's cool, though.
It's really cool. It's kind of prototype of it. I'd like to know if it's sitting in water or whatever. But yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah. I think it is. It is. So this next part, soon afterwards, the Sikuri or low wines begins to run. From that point, care is needed only to keep the water in the cooling barrel thoroughly cold, either with ice, which I guess they'd have a plentiful supply of, or with fresh cold water. So that's really familiar. Although he's saying allow the low wines to run as quickly as possible without becoming warm or giving off vapor. So yeah, another measure of speed, but good sage advice in terms of keeping that water very, very cold in the condenser. And then he even recommends a good person in Turku, where this book was published. Ollongren, he makes very good ones, and a very good price, moderate. So that is described the first distillation because, as you'll see, we are talking about distilling it twice. But then there's a little bit of a bit of touch that's kind of coming in here as well. But so the length of time for which the still should run depends upon the strength of the plandy and upon the quantity placed in the still. They should be collected for as long as they taste slightly sweet. As soon as they become sour, a fresh charge of mash or plandy should be put into the still after the spent mash has first been discharged. So sour, kind of, he's talking about it running into faints after the I've never really thought of that as sour. Pretty grim. It starts to taste a bit funky and a bit.
Like sour is performing a number of different functions. Sourness is just wrong.
Yes, and there could be a translating effect here, but let's just say negative. It tastes rank. It starts to taste a bit rank. And then, so second distillation. The low wines contain partly much water, so they're not strong enough, and other foreign substances. You then need to do it again, and this is called the chloraminen or redistillation. Same method, same manner as the first boiling, but at this point we don't need to worry about scorching or spurting.
No.
Faints. So testing the faints and knowing when to stop distilling effectively. So the redistilled spirit should be allowed to run for as long as it feels strong and burns with a vigorous blue fat flame. So they're doing a little flame test on it. And for as long as the characteristic fainty taste of the late tailings, the lanky, cannot yet be detected in it. The main spirit run, the hearts, I suppose we could call it, the Syokski, literally the rush, comes over first. Strongest at the beginning, gradually becomes weaker. They're understanding a lot about it. And the late tailings, when they begin to run, their characteristic taste, or rank, as I described it, spoils the spirit. Yeah. So a little bit of a scientific test, but then also, there's touch, there's feel, there's craft, whatever you want to call it. Some people have commonly taken low wines equal to 1/4 of the volume of the whole plandy. So he's kind of saying you could just do it by volume, like reduce it effectively, focus it, condense it, distill it. It's better to taste it and judge from that what should be done. And he kind of reassures people, learn, just do it a few times, it will be clear, you'll work it out.
Yeah.
And then beading is another way. So beading is, if you don't know, it's when you shake a spirit and you see the little bubbles that form on the edge of whatever vessel you're shaking it in, and how vigorous or how persistent those beads form indicates strength. So To determine when the good spirit should be separated from the last drops, take a little of the running spirit in a small glass bottle and shake it. This shows where the beads form upon the spirit. So, yeah, again, familiar, logical. Oh, I did have a bit about still house construction there. Yeah, so stone floor is indispensable in every distilling room. I've kind of said this already, actually, a bit, but yeah, if it's built of wood, you've got to make sure it's really airtight with putty and a bit of tar, sifted lime, hard into the cracks, and yeah, coat the walls, ceiling, and roof beams with heated tar. And this is to preserve the wood from all the steam that's coming on. Yep. Because we are describing distillation in rural Finland, which is generally to the north of Finland from relative to where Julian lived and where the book was published, which is a pretty chilly place. Yep. So when should you distill? And that's quite interesting here. So a prudent householder will take many circumstances into account when his people are free from other necessary work, and when and how the spent mash can best be used for the benefit of the livestock, with other considerations. But again, feeding the livestock is crucial to this whole process. There's a few factors, but the livestock are really, really important. But I'm presumably being able to feed those livestock over winter and summer. So, well, yeah, summer first. Least suitable, difficult to keep the cooling water cold. They want that ice. They want that cool ambient temperature, because otherwise you might get your mash turning musty or sour. Colder is better because ice can be obtained. But if there is no separate warm room for the mash vessel, severe frost may freeze the mash and stop its fermentation, with the result that very little spirit is obtained. I have never heard of mash freezing in Scotland.
No.
That is not a problem we have over here.
So it is. If you look at the very early Canadian distillates for Applejack and stuff, they would effectively just make cider and place it outside and allow it to freeze over, and then just take the ice off, which effectively is the water, leaving strong, effectively brandy or applejack underneath. So, you know, I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, no, cool. And some people call that ice cider now, don't they? But it's not quite the real ice cider. Anyway, let's not get too caught up in that. But seasons. So, yes. So refrain from distilling during the coldest part of winter. And the conclusion is spring is the most suitable for distilling, because the milder and more even weather than prevailing assists fermentation, and also you don't get the problems of extreme cold. Going back to cleanliness, there's actually a recommendation here that fits with the weather, so I left it here. But it's good to allow the tun to freeze over whenever the season permits. Can't do that in spring. And then scrub it with juniper water and lye again. You can just scrub it with juniper water and lye, but that might be insufficient to prevent sourness. So a good idea is to let your presumably empty vessels freeze over, thereby...
but saving them from any bacterial infection.
Yeah, cool. I thought that was fun.
So I was just looking at the comments here, and I seem to be unable to bring them up. We've got some translation going on in our comments.
Oh, good. I hope that might happen, but I was also afraid of it.
Yeah. Everything we've said is wrong.
No, tell me that's not true.
No.
They're evening all. Tuma seems to be an inch in the case of the pipes, which sounds about right.
Apparently means a thumb.
Oh, okay, cool.
So,
Tuma equals thumb. Thanks, multi-mission. Okay, so that's broadly running through the process in the distillery. Although I will just say, and actually the content of the book, pretty much in its entirety, but then we're going to unpick a few bits at the end when we do a little bit of discussion. But I should also mention there's a lot about bread. There's a good chunk about bread and using potatoes for making bread, and some delicious sounding recipes for potato bread, which I love. I love potato bread. And one slightly less delicious one. We haven't got time to go into all the recipes, but they were cool, but not relevant to our show. But this one just had to be mentioned. To make paltu bread, clean and reduce the potatoes as described. Mix blood into the potato pulp and mix in rye flour, and then make your bread. And that was blood of the cow, the pig, or the reindeer. I think like moose, reindeer type thing, which I guess is sounds a bit unpalatable now, but I guess it's using all element. You're using an element of the butchery process. We make blood sausage, I suppose, have done for many places around Europe.
Why not have blood?
Yeah, and presumably a source of iron as well. So I'm not sure we're going to recreate that one. So generally speaking, with some oddities, broadly familiar, Dave?
Yeah. Very familiar. It's it really is. It's essentially making a grain-based spirit in a highly recognizable way for that time. It's great. Extraordinary find.
I thought of one element that is missing to this process that wasn't mentioned. I haven't excluded it. Dave, have you spotted it?
There appears to be scant evidence of maturation.
Exactly that. Although I would also say, and I'm doing this slightly from memory, the same is true of McDonald in 1828. Now we do know it's happened. Again, another past Liquid Antiquarian episode if you look at the birth of maturation. But in terms of commercial, it's all
there.
But I don't think McDonald is really mentioned that either. And a lot of spirit, the vast majority of spirit, even at that time, would have been drunk without maturation, except that happens with transport. But there's no mention of this. And I had a little read around, and I did find a couple of casks.
Oh,
aren't they rather pretty?
Yeah,
so the one in the left, again relying on translations, both from the National Museum of Finland, but the one on the left is like a transport cask. I don't think there was an intention for maturation as such. And the one on the right was, according to the museum, to collect sikuri, which is the spirit. I think it was sikuri, the word. I'm gradually learning antiquated Finnish distilling terms. But casks, of course, like many places, were the standard vessel for storage and transport in many ways. But I believe both those casks were made from pine rather than oak, which
not good.
It doesn't sound great. You wouldn't want it sitting in there for too long, and I imagine they're very, very old casks. But there doesn't seem to be an intention to distill in order to mature.
I also thought the one right looks a bit like Count Binface.
Yeah, go on, the Count. We're all rooting for you.
People have come in. Anyway.
So let's kind of recap. I think we'll come back a little bit to compare and contrast maybe to the discussion. But so we've done book, we've done kind of contents of the book, and now we're going to start talking about and a bit about of the equipment, the grains, the technique, and the farm economy. But especially when we start to talk about farm economy, we're going to revisit that now by talking about the people, the person who wrote it, the person who commissioned it, who it's for, and a little bit about the politics. So where am I? I am here. So this is the preface, which I left till now. Although much distilled spirits is made in Finland, few well-appointed distilling establishments are to be found. Distilling has most often been carried on in ordinary brew houses or in the so-called cattle huts, partly with lifting stills, so the actual word was nostopanut, partly with built-in cauldrons, or also with kettles, which for that purpose are furnished with a breast, head and pipes. Okay, so he's kind of describing what's happening.
Mhm.
The purpose of these instructions is to bring this distilling apparatus into a more useful and complete condition, so that more spirit may be gained with the least expenditure of grain materials and fuel. They have been written following the request which the late governor of Viborg province, Knight Karl Sternvall, made during his lifetime to the Imperial Finnish Household Society. So the bits I'm going to talk about now is, well, Johannes Julin, Viborg province, and Knight Karl Sternvall, and the Imperial Finnish Society. Okay, so these are all the people, and also the farmers. So the first thing to say is that this book is not written to say we should try this new thing called distilling and we should try distilling our grains. As you can see, there's been loads of references to this is what people are already doing. That's fine, but maybe try this instead. So this document shows that farm distilling of spirit, that in early 19th century terms, if it was made in Scotland, would be called whiskey. Not Usquebae, not aquavitae, whiskey. That was the word for whiskey. It didn't need to be matured in order to be called whiskey. There were a few different words used, but absolutely, you can legitimately call it whiskey. Yes, Dave?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so that is already happening and is relatively widespread. There's loads of different techniques. And this guy, Julin, has been commissioned by Sternvall in order to improve it. And this Finnish Household Society, we can think of in terms of like an improver society in Scotland. They've been around for quite a while, like back into the 1790s, apparently. And this is the one reference that I did find. I can't quite remember his name. Sorry. I'll get onto that in a sec. Ziliacus, which sounds like an ancient name, but it's not. It's someone who's writing around 2000, who's an academic, and he went through the Household Society, also called the Economic Society. It depends on the translation. Literally, I think it means household. And he went through their entire archive. And one of the things he said is, I find it strange that distilling historians haven't really consulted this archive. I tend to agree because there's a lot in there. And yeah, so back into the 1790s, 1795, I think Ziliacus said that they had already made efforts to improve it. But there's a few things happening with Finnish politics at the moment that are absolutely making this. There's an energy for change and there's a reason for reorganization and change, which I'll come on to. So Julin, the guy who wrote it, he was tasked, because none of this was written down, to write this book. Now, it was published in Swedish. The version I found was published in Finnish. I've not seen this Swedish version yet. And the fact that it was written in Finnish is relevant because that means it is written for rural Finland rather than in Swedish, which might be for the slightly if I can use the word, higher levels of society, the administrative class, the upper classes would tend to speak Swedish. Political reasons we'll come on to pretty soon. So it was published in Turku. So I haven't highlighted it, but Turku, if you look towards the bottom of the map, just west of Helsinki, Turku is there, and that was the former capital of Finland, but Helsinki had been made the capital, but it was in a period of flux. So Turku was like an educational, scientific kind of center of the region, and still operated as such. Now, so it was published in Turku, excuse me, and Julin was an apothecary.
Right.
So, well, to my ears, first of all, apothecary makes me think of, snakes in jars and weird potions and things like that. But an apothecary, yes, they might have a shop that you could think of like a kind of chemist dispensary type idea, but they also had a respected role in society, and they were also there was a really scientific element to them as well. And so he was, it's not a surprise that an apothecary has been asked to do this, because that's where a lot of knowledge, scientific knowledge and expertise is held. So he's a man who understands science, who reads about science, who does experiments, that type of thing. It is relatively safe to assume. So Sternval, the knight. So I've put his daughter on there. We'll come on to her in a moment, rather. So Sternval we can put at the center of a great deal of political change, because Sternval's life was, I mean, it sounds pretty Swedish as a name. Finland was under the control of Sweden. The Swedes fought the Russians. Sternval was a knight because he fought for the Swedes against the Russians. The Swedes lost. Sternval was captured, and then was appointed the governor of Viborg, which is effectively a newly created administrative area that I think, and it was a little bit confusing to me, but I think was actually, before this happened, a part of Russia. Okay. And so it's actually, if I take the map off, it is now part of Russia as well. So where Finland comes back across to the left there, about level with the word of Finland itself, into Russia there, this area was part of it. So there's a newly created administrative area, which Sternval, after being captured by the Russians, is then appointed as the governor of it. So there's a kind of, it's not just spirit production, there's lots of areas that they are reorganizing society effectively, and spirit production is one of those things. So quite a fascinating dynamic life. And this is all happening within basically a period of 10 years or so from this 1815 kind of period. All this stuff is happening. So it's right in the center of it. It also, I think I read this out, but he said the late governor. So he commissions it. By the time it's published, he's died. Right. His wife then remarries with his successor. Yes. Not.
This will be Shakespearean about this.
I've got no explanation, but I have to mention it. And then I just want to mention his daughter, so Eva Aurora Charlotta Karamzin, so née Sternval. So she is sometimes known as Princess Aurora, I believe, and she became a prominent figure in Finnish high society, and became one of the most prominent philanthropists in Finnish society. So there's one bit on the political side, which I'll kick myself if I don't go back and just mention this, so allow me. So after all this has happened, Finland becomes a Grand Duchy of Russia.
Right, okay.
So it's a Grand Duchy of Finland, basically. So it is part of Russia, but with a degree of autonomy, such as Sternval's role. So that's the politics behind it all. And this household society is a movement for improvement, which again feels familiar to what was happening in Scotland.
Yes.
Pretty fascinating. I mean, I had to...
Yeah. Again, fascinating parallels, yeah. But in some ways not surprising. You get so, I think we get so caught up in wearing our Scotch blinkers, and we think this is the only place that this was happening. And no, this is a major global cultural movement. Okay.
Yes. So we're learning so far. Lots of people that are distilling something that you could legitimately call whiskey according to the terms of the time. There is a movement to improve it. Mm-hmm. And then what happens? Why is this not known now? And now we're starting to talk about state control and the attitude to alcohol as you move through the 19th century and soon after. And we can talk immediately about Johann's son, also called Johann, so Junior, let's call him that. So this is him writing to the Household Society secretary again, just 14 years later. Elevate the education of the common people, give them hope for nobler pleasures, and we can be certain that drunkenness will decrease. It is oppression, misery, and coarseness that breed and increase the craving for spirits. So we are starting to move into this a different attitude to spirits and alcohol in general. And funnily enough, when I was on this visit with Helsinki, we had a dinner at the end, and I was sitting next to a woman who is distilling in what sounded like quite a small little distillery. They made a bit of whiskey, they made some other spirits, that type of thing, and we were eating a moose stew, and no, a moose steak, a massive moose steak.
Moose bush. Yes. Anyway,
and I hadn't had the chance to meet her elsewhere during the conference, and I asked her about where her distillery was and things like that. And she said the name of this town, which escapes me, as well as her name, which is awful because she was a really nice person. And she said, "You know, the town where they make the scissors." I was like, the scissors? And then she said, the orange scissors.
The orange
scissors? And I was like, oh, the orange scissors. An absolute design classic.
Yeah.
So where's my bit on Fiskars? So this chap, also an apothecary, Johann, he carried on his father's trade. He then bought an ironworks in 1822, so 7 years after his father's death, and he bought the Fiskars ironwork, and he started making, from 1832, he started making knives and forks, razors and penknives, and scissors. Of course, they didn't have the plastic orange handles, which is so iconic. I think it's, they're in museums in New York as a design classic. It is an absolute design classic. You've got some. So that is. Say again?
Left-handed ones as well.
Oh, are you left-handed?
No, Rosie's left-handed.
Oh, okay.
And left-handed people can't use right-handed scissors because you forget the scissors are actually right or left-handed. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
Scissors. But this is, I just wanted to mention it because it's an amazing link, and I'm hopeful that it's quite meaningful to the Finns because they are very, very proud of those scissors. And this is the son of the guy who wrote this pamphlet. But anyway, by this point, he is starting to become anti-alcohol. So I mentioned the high authority, and which order shall I do this? Yeah, no, I'll wait a tiny bit for this. But basically, when you get to 1865, they actually move farm distillation away from farms because licenses aren't granted. It's not a total free-for-all, and towards large units that are easily taxable, easily monitorable, and also efficient.
Sure.
Because right through the discussion we've already seen, there's this concern about wasting elements as well. So it seems like the distilleries remained rather small, and then the high authority said, no, let's move it to centralized government production, effectively, government supervised production. Yeah, I will mention how it was done before. So around this period, from what I could glean, the stills were licensed by size, which is familiar to periods of Scotland pre-1823 in particular. The Small Stills Act, for example, was a response to that. But so you paid a license fee according to size, but that was tied to the amount of land you had and the kind of the size and productiveness of the land.
Okay.
So the idea was that you could produce a certain amount of grain, therefore you had that type of still. So it was an expectation that, you know, that was the grain that went into this still, and there would still be enough for food effectively. And they are relatively, I did some of the still size conversions, and they are relatively small, nothing like the lowland distilleries. So a different approach based around preserving what did come from the land and the materials that had before. So, but this is happening after, so that 1865 thing is happening actually before the real rise of temperance and the kind of even discussions getting close to talking about prohibition. So it's 1870s where you start to get groups advocating for banning of spirit drinking. 1880s before any real momentum, and it actually comes close a few times to actually banning spirits, let alone all alcohol. But then, and there's a few semi-prohibitions that happened during First World War, for example. The aristocracy is still allowed to drink, but yeah, because, you know, they're making all the big decisions. They should be able to do that drunk,
control themselves.
Yeah. But prohibition came in Finland 1919 to 1932, and then when that comes out of prohibition, you have effectively still a level of state control which is unusual to people living in the UK, for example, where all alcohol is effectively sold through the government, through Alko is the name of it, the equivalent of the Swedish Systembolaget, and most of Canada is a similar example as well. So that's kind of our answer for what happens, really. The tide turns, but there is almost an element of control.
It disappears. A couple of interesting comments there from Rasmus.
Let's have a look. There we go. What's he saying? Ooh. Not sure, but I'm sure it's interesting.
That's your archive.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Yes. Lars Ziliakos. Yeah. And then the distillery in Fiskas will be Agras. That's it. Mark Lehner. Yeah. I'm sure. Yeah. Very nice person. I'm going to send this to her with apologies that under pressure, I forgot her name. And we can't, I mean, everyone loves pictures of prohibition related smuggling. And there are some cool ones from Finland as well. So this is Finns drinking alcohol outside, basically going on a boat, getting outside the territorial waters. Say again, sorry?
That would never happen today.
No. Yeah, from 1826, according to the source there. Lovely picture. Then this, which is a slightly vague date, but even 100 years later, there's real echoes of what's in that pamphlet. So I've put the translation as I can hope that it is correct anyway. But the top two was wasting grain and sugar. That's why you shouldn't do it. So it's described as the illicit distiller, the disgrace of the province. And there's this very shady looking guy distilling in the poster. But waste grain and sugar, ravages and burns the forest. And then you start talking about tax and lowering standard of living and crime and disrupts work and bringing discords into the home, which was so much more prominent in the prohibition movements elsewhere, like the effect of women who can, you know, when their salaries are being drunk away by the husbands, etc. So I thought that was quite telling, Dave.
Yeah, it's very telling. It's really interesting. Yeah.
But I mean, it's a very different climate. It's presumably a lot less productive land, and they have long winters to get through. So it makes a lot of sense. These are cool. So it's a seized alcohol image. Now, lots of bottles. You can almost try and zoom in. That triangular one on the right looks familiar to actually maybe a Scotch bottle. Who knows? But you see these metal canisters at the bottom.
Yeah, what are they?
Well, you see the curve on the right. And there was other images I saw, and they reminded me of, what do you call them in Scotland when they would smuggle stuff out of the distillery with the
belly flask.
Belly flasks. Yeah. It reminded me of those. But yes, you could hide them under clothing, but they were like transported like that in large quantities. There's another great image of a car with stacks and stacks of these, and they actually stack quite well.
Right.
And they'd be filled with very high strength spirit that then would be cut when it got to whatever destination it would be. And in one place they called them sparrows, but that might be similar to the belly flask idea. But they were transported like that. And so you see that one there, not looking at the boat or the people, but the kind of girder, I suppose you could call it, at the bottom there.
Was that there? Kind of.
So this is what they would call a pertu. Pertu is the spirit, I think, the high strength spirit torpedo. So they would have this thing, and they would fix these metal things along to outside, and then this is a better image of the torpedo. So it's obviously a museum model, a museum on the kind of fortress island of Suomenlinna, which I tried to go to this customs museum, but unfortunately it was shut. But I found it on the day I went there. But yeah, so they would tow it along, and then if a customs boat came along, because obviously water is, especially around the population centres, a way of transporting things. So a lot of it was kind of waterborne smuggling. And yeah, so if the customs guy came along, they could just like detach it, and, drop it in the side, and then maybe come back and get it later on. But that made me think of US torpedoes when you talk about US prohibition.
I kind of flashed in my mind. Oh, prohibition torpedoes. Yeah.
And I've definitely heard or read like people talking about torpedoes in America, and like saying that, they even fired torpedoes into the land and stuff like that. And you kind of imagine these kind of like, like actually ordnance, like, but actually. So I gave it a little look, and here's some American ones. So the ones on the left look more like torpedoes.
They do.
But they were filled, and I think they were dragged as well, in a similar way to Finland. And then the one on the right is they actually rigged. Say again?
Kind of winched in.
Yeah. So they would kind of set up these secret winching systems to transport it across.
Amazing.
I mean, that's obviously not the sea, but across rivers or whatever it might be, presumably a river dividing Canada and America. In actual fact, Detroit River. Yeah, there we go. So that's customs officer dismantling one of these kind of contraptions, and then this delightful. Well, you mentioned Count Binface; he's back.
There he is.
Some impromptu kind of diving bell to investigate these things. So anyway, when people talk about torpedoes in America, I think we can, I'm not sure I really thought that they were fired from submarines or anything. But anyway, this is a kind of, so the Finns had these torpedoes.
Amazing. Amazing. That's great. That's delighted me.
Cool.
I mean,
we've been going for nearly an hour and a half, Dave. That can't be right.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you. We see the numbers. You're still sticking with us. My God, you crew. You're just great.
Thank you, as ever, for your input. By the way.
Who have we got? Alan Wilsonhome. Yeah. Fashions on the boat drinkers were like my granny. That's a nice. Belly flask, aka Breisters. Yeah. Excellent. Discussion time, Dave.
Yeah.
How does this change our thinking, and what next? Because I feel like this might not be the end of the story. I mean, I suppose the first thing, how does this change our thinking, is what do we know about? What did you know about the Scandinavian region in the early 19th century? And Zero.
I assumed, given proximity, and this is perhaps been part of the wider discussion. Obviously, distillation would be going on, and a proximity to Russia, where there was lots of distillation going on. Kind of logical that there might be something, but this kind of opens up a whole new area of exploration, because the links are so clear to what is happening elsewhere, certainly in Scotland and Ireland, but also, across Europe, Netherlands, etc., etc. And I mean, for me, the lessons, as ever, are it's another example of why we have to stop thinking of this hierarchy of whiskey, with Scotch at the top and everybody else kind of begun to understand it, and the Scots taught everybody, or the Scots and the Irish taught everybody about whiskey, and it's not true, and I think this proves it, that this knowledge was being either disseminated all across Europe. I mean, forget about the US for the moment. That all this knowledge was getting disseminated and being applied across Europe, whether it was by documents, whether it was by as an oral tradition, or whether it was quite possibly people finding solutions to the same problem in a similar way. But I find it absolutely fascinating, and I think it's another great example of democratizing the story of whiskey. That these places that you think of as being new whiskey producers, which I think I've got huge respect for what's huge excitement about what's happening going on in the Nordics at the moment. But story which I've written and so many other people have written, and even distillers themselves have talked about, is that effectively this is brand new. We're breaking new ground. So to be able to come across this it anchors it, I think, and I think not just from a production point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, and from the sense of this has been done before, that this has been part of our culture. This is not something that has been brought in. It's not an imported technique, an imported spirit that we are making our own. It has actually been part of the culture for considerably longer than perhaps we understood. And I think that is quite powerful. So I'm kind of looking at it in maybe a slightly more abstract way, but I think from an emotional and a philosophical point of view, I think it's hugely important.
No, I was in the same space, Dave. Absolutely, that's why it excited me. The thought, and there's a few thoughts I have while you're talking. One is, and I totally get your point. We shouldn't be so Scotch centric. But however, it makes me think back to Scotland and think, why Scotland? Why did Scotland go bananas and become not quite the preeminent whiskey producer in the world for a long period of time? There was Ireland, there was America, there was lots going on, but it did well, let's face it, and especially when you look at the malt spirit style as well. So given the time, we probably don't have too much time to talk about it, but it's the exceptionalism of Scotland is further clarified by the fact that other people were doing very similar things. So why is it that Scotland did so well? Yeah. And as I was doing this research and going through and thinking about it, there's almost a slightly arrogant assumption that was, well, they did it better than anyone else. And there's a few things in here that sound a bit ropey to my, naive knowledge of distillation. But they were doing some pretty good things. They could have easily have developed, and there was probably some pretty bad whiskey. We know there was some bad whiskey made in Scotland as well. So you've got to look at like the administrative, taxation, political situation that is the trigger, rather than the brilliance of the Scots. And undoubtedly, they built a brilliant industry that made delicious whiskey that conquered the world with the help of the empire and all the networks that brings. But so thinking about that, I thought about the relationship to alcohol and where Scotland was at this point in 1815, And Scotland was in a total mess at this point. It was lawless and bloody, and so much whiskey was made illegally. You just don't get that impression in Finland here. It seems to be a relative. The concern is, yes, sure, make your whiskey, and we've given you a license, and that's fine, but just don't waste the wood. Don't waste the grain. That's the principal concern. There isn't this panic that they've lost control of the country. They just wanted them to do it better, which is quite different.
Yeah.
And it was 1865, I think I said, when they effectively banned or shifted distillation from farms to larger units. In Scotland, that happened way back in the 18th century. Yeah. Not quite 100 years before, but 70, 80 years before, when private distillation was effectively banned and driven underground. So I think you might have this situation where Scotland is heavy-handed, it gets driven underground, they're then forced to solve that problem. And their solution to it is 1823, which is big state control again, but meaning they can make it in smaller units, but also it requires really significant capital in order to do it.
Yeah, it's incentivization. It's capitalism coming into control, which I don't see happening in Finland.
No, buy a condenser.
It strikes me that they're quite happy for everything to be nice and small and actually make it better. And you might be able to sell some stuff, but you'll be able to feed your reindeer or cows or whatever. Whereas in Scotland, it's a really, really good point you've made there. Whereas in Scotland, there is incentivization to introduce capital and create an industry.
Yeah.
You don't see this in Finland. Even by bringing it under state control, I don't think you see the motivation to create an actual industry. The state control. Speaking to friends in Norway about this, the state control is almost like quasi-prohibition. We will control how much is made, and we will control how much you're allowed to drink. So, which is the complete opposite to what is happening in Scotland, which is a laissez-faire approach to distillation and investing capital. Go ahead, make yourself a business, make as much as you want, and we will sell it around the world. So, two completely different models.
So, so there's two phases to my argument. This one. In order, post 1823, you have to have capital, you have to have a business, you have to be serious about it. You can't play it. You can't play at this. Yeah. We know. I would say that's kind of well established with the work we've done, and well established in the kind of whiskey history community or whatever. So then you get some pretty serious businesses, people investing quite a bit of money, which you don't get in Finland. In both countries, then you start to get temperance movements rising. Okay. But the Finnish businesses are all these tiny, they're farmers, basically. There's nothing, it seems, in the record that says there's anything significant. So when then temperance rises, and when there's a movement to quash spirit, they can't defend themselves against that. They just have to give up. But in Scotland, you've already, by the 1850s, 1860s, and certainly by the 1880s, you've got some very serious businesses who are moving in the corridors of power. So they don't that often actively speak out against him. You don't see them lobbying, but they must have been fighting their corner, and you can't take this away from me. So even though the temperance movements are incredibly strong in Scotland and in England, spirit production and whiskey production cannot be quashed because they are significant industrialists, proto-industrialists, whatever, businessmen.
I like that. I think the exception. I actually think that it's a complete separate episode. To be honest, the exception to that, is what happens in the States, because distilled spirits was the biggest, contributed most in terms of taxation to the American economy at the tail end of the 19th century. It was the second biggest industry in America. A lot of booze was being made, yet America went into prohibition in officially in 1919, but effectively from the beginning of the 20th century. So, an uber capitalist industry in the States fell foul to the temperance movement, and I think there's a whole number of different. It's not quite the same scenario, but yeah, I mean, it's worth kind of picking the bones out of that one, I think.
Yeah. So I suppose when we're talking about what next as well, there's a few things here. Like, I hope that people are happy with the translations that we've got, but I do think it requires some friendly soul. And I think there's been a few Finns on tonight. I think a few more will come out of the woodwork, as hopefully this is shared around. If you know people who are Finnish and interested in distillation, I do hope they get to see this episode. Please share it on. We want people to discuss it, and we don't mind a bit of a challenge. So, but I do think it needs, a Finnish national to who understands distillation to give another go at this distillation. So we definitely need to do that. But then I also hope there's people who understand a bit more about Finnish history as well, and who can read Finnish historical articles to put this in a bit better context. I've done the best I can. I hope I haven't dropped any awful clangers. But it was more challenging than a lot of our episodes. But I do hope they start to look at it a bit more. And I do hope people start digging a bit more into not just Finland, but Sweden, because obviously the places were linked, Russia, Denmark, Norway, and find out what else was going on here, because there was more going on. I did actually get a couple of slides, which we can't forget about the egg either. There's an egg moment coming. So this is, well, actually, Dave, I credit you for this, because you said, oh, what about Morewood? And so Morewood is two publications, 1824, and then a second edition, 1838.
Yep.
And he did have this passage about Finland, which bore a striking resemblance to Mr. John Barrow. And it wasn't in the 1824 edition, it was in the 1838 edition. And so I think he's kind of lifted it from John Barrow, who was a chap who went around the north of Europe in 1830 and 1833. So we found nothing whatever but the ardent spirit called vodka, which really feels like a hybridation of whiskey and vodka. But anyway, when our little stock of brandy was exhausted, we had no alternative but to resort to this native liquor, which we had heard much abused and execrated as a most villainous beverage, but which we did not find to deserve such a character. The flavour is more that of whiskey than any other spirit, exceedingly fiery, but when mixed with hot water and sugar is by no means unpleasant. A couple of things there. So firstly, it sounds like he's tasting grain-based cereal distillation, but that water and sugar thing's quite interesting, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah, it's a toddy. Yeah.
It's a toddy, so he's got that experience of drinking toddies over there. Then when he was in Norway, the spirit is distilled from barley and sometimes, I believe, from rye and oats. It's flavoured rather strongly, sometimes with aniseed and sometimes with, that's a mistype, with caraway seed. At least so we thought, though we understood the peculiar flavour was given by the flowers of some of the mountain plants, perhaps the juniper berry with the addition of a little sugar. So that feels like aquavit.
That's aquavit, yeah.
That feels like a kind of aquavit type spirit.
Aquavit, but yeah.
But that wasn't mentioned at all. There's no mention of botanicals or other things added on. Like in Finland, it's pure grain-based spirit, just like whiskey.
Yeah, down the line, yeah.
And then this is a different chap, Arthur de Capel Brooke, in his travels of Norway. Oh, I drew this, I liked it, but there's a couple of slides here, and it's basically the kind of traveller thing, which is quite familiar. So he was out of brandy, and he had to buy a small quantity of him. I can't remember who he was, maybe a ship's captain or something. I was obliged to give 6 marks the bottle, 6 shillings, which is 6 shillings English, an enormous price, I was afterwards told. I just like getting ripped off. Getting ripped off. Yeah. But it's impossible to get on in the northern parts without this commodity. And the quantity that was consumed during my tour is almost incredible. Brandy in use here is made from rye, chiefly comes from Christiana, where the principal distilleries are. From the fondness, however, which the lower orders have for this liquor, it is smuggled in great quantities all along the coast, from Flensburg and Bremen, particularly in Finnmark, which is the area that runs across Finland and over into Denmark. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. Maybe a bit Norway as well, which the Sami people are mostly known to inhabit. And then, here comes our egg moment, Dave. So, an English captain going to the North Cape with marks of the greatest astonishment. Preparations were instantly made for an entertainment, which, for saying it would detain us for a considerable time, I declined with as much earnestness as possible. Brandy, however, was quickly produced and a bumper handed around to all, after which an egg dram was served up. The reader may perhaps be curious to know the composition of this odd, though heart-reviving mixture, which is presented to every stranger on his arrival when a compliment is intended. It is simply the yolk of an egg beaten up with sugar and a subsequent addition of a glass of rum. So, yeah, here we go. So we're going to give it a go. Right, crack that. Ooh, yeah, okay. I made a bit of an arse of that. Okay. I've got my sugar. I've got my whisk. You've got a proper barman's whisk. I've got my doilies. And then, yeah, the other thing, so it's sugary egg, then rum. Is that right? Or do you put the rum in? I can't remember.
Yeah, I put the rum in.
You put the rum in. That's good because mine's gone a bit claggy. Okay, cool. And the other, well, yours looks good. Okay, I'm just in a light bucket. And before we possibly have to close the episode through gagging, the other next step, I think, is very much, and we delayed this episode because we were thinking about getting in touch with somebody and saying, do you want to make some of these recipes? And we would love to make some of these recipes with a Finnish distiller who found this episode interesting, who is inspired to know that there were people making a kind of prototype whiskey in their country, which seems to have been largely undiscovered up to now. So we would love to do that. But so should we drink to that possibility?
There was one final question from
okay.
Your daughter, actually.
My daughter?
Is that a fresh white t-shirt?
That's an inside joke. They like me in a fresh white tea. And who else? The Lost Cartographer. Oh my word. I was looking at the maps and trying to get this Viborg thing and I got in an awful mess with it trying to use old maps. It got very, very confusing. I could have done with your help. Toby, love Toby, from over in Norway. Great person. He's got his own whiskey project on the go, actually, Dave. We should hear about that soon.
Let me know.
And what else is yes, you've been very helpful. Thank you for your I'm not sure how you break up your name. Rasmus Ackerblom. There we go. Thank you for your excursion to our neck of the woods. The small scale distillation seems to be taken to the woods after the 1860s and stays there. Yeah, that's not to say illicit distillation doesn't happen very much. So,
thank you, Arthur. Down Hatch. We've got more exciting things coming your way. Very, very exciting things. I'm going to say no more, but watch this space or watch your social media, etc. We've just completed something which is pretty amazing, I think. Anyway.
I love your optimism, Dave. We are nowhere near completing that. Yeah. But anyway, thank you. I love your optimism.
You just never tell the truth, Arthur. I keep telling you that. Okay. Thank you. Here's to you. Amazing, amazing work. Okay. And thanks to all our patrons. I'm going to drink this now.
In one? Yeah. Gee, that's all right.
Surprisingly nice.
That's quite nice. My heart is revived.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I got a bit under this.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
quite good.
Pass me a chicken.
So I think that's it, Dave. Thanks so much for all your support in this research. You were a shoulder to lean on through a lot of it, and
They are broad.
yeah. Thank you, everyone. Cheerio. Good night.
Well.